Agent Kami here. When I grew up, my father and uncle were both quite right-wing. My brother and myself were left, though we were much more old left than the SJWs prevalent today. This would have been back, say, in the late 80s and early 90s. Plus, I myself was right-wing for a time, somewhat later, probably from around 1999 to 2006 or so. Conversely, I was staunchly leftist from around 91 to 99 and started to go left again around 2007. Long and short, I see both sides. I see where both sides are strong and where they're weak. Also, the fact that they're alike in curious ways. I've followed both Breitbart and HuffPost for years, and the underlying similarities in a lot of ways never fail to amaze me. For example, both left and right today have gone through epistemic closure, meaning that, as belief systems, they've become closed and hermetically sealed. Right-wing philosophy hasn't really changed much since Reagan's time. Following the collapse of the USSR, completely ossified. The defeat of communism, which was always a central and overriding goal of the US right, resulted in a sense of redundancy. To stay relevant, the American right has had to target the enemy within now rather than the Soviets, and so began a long and gradual march into the fever swamps of paranoia and conspiracy that we see today. Preoccupation with FEMA camps, chemtrails, water fluoridation in the manner of the paranoid General Ripper from Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, obsessions over Democratic Party politicians coming to take their guns away, God expressing disfavor with America's increasing liberalization and secularism with natural disasters, and so on. This is what is meant by epistemic closure. The ideology becomes increasingly paranoid and fanatical in the face of its growing irrelevance and redundancy. When the US left began displaying similar fanatical and paranoid characteristics in the years following the election of President Obama, obsessions over microaggressions, safe spaces, trigger warnings, cultural appropriation, and so on, they were following a well-worn path. It was not in spite of, but rather because of America's election of a black president that the social justice warrior phenomena took off when it did and how it did. This event did for the US left what the collapse of the USSR did for the US right, leave them with a dread of existential redundancy. It was around the time of Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution of the mid-1990s that the practice of demonizing political opponents really took off. Indeed, Gingrich undertook many measures that contributed to the mounting political polarization that plagues American politics to this day. Under his leadership, the congressional GOP began a policy of absolute obstructionism, carried on by the Tea Party after their 2010 capture of Congress that so well resembled Gingrich's Republican Revolution of '94. Gingrich theorized that a Congress rendered ineffective in this manner would feed into and legitimize the U.S. right's anti-big government spin in the eyes of the electorate. In 1996, Gingrich also issued a memo to GOPAC, a Republican state and local political training organization entitled Language, a Key Mechanism of Control, wherein he instructs GOP campaigners to use intentionally ratcheted-up, morally charged language to frame issues and vilify their liberal Democratic opponents. In short soundbite statements which tended to be repeated with mantra-like frequency. A decade and a half later, when the SJWs emerged onto the social media scene with their own politics of moral outrage, they were merely putting their own spin on the playbook that Gingrich himself wrote. The launching of Fox News in '96 didn't help matters, nor did the proliferation of right-wing AM talk radio. What Gingrich's influence on the GOP and the overall conservative retreat into their own echo chambers resulted in was a greater propensity towards groupthink on the US right. A number of other factors, ongoing gerrymandering resulting in the more intense battles taking place within the parties being between the moderates and the hardliners, rather than the parties going and competing against one another for the support of the moderate center, a gradual and progressive geographic sorting of liberals into coastal regions and urban centers, and conservatives into more rural and suburban regions, resulted in less personal contact between people with divergent politics. It was the beginning of the long march of American politics into the dark night of political echo chambers, areas where each side could say what it wanted without being challenged by the other side. The left was a bit slower to follow suit, not really doing the same thing until the internet age was in full swing, but the left was quicker to adapt to the internet, gaining an early advantage and a stronger presence in social media that the right still hasn't really recovered from. Only in its very recent adaptation of meme magic and the broader anti-SJW campaign beginning with the whole Gamergate fiasco, did the right begin to match the left on social media, and given the very pervasive bias towards the social justice left prevalent in social media moderation, the right still has a fair bit of catching up to do. Epistemic closure gives rise to both right and left having obsessions that tend not to register with non-politically aligned people, who also constitute the bulk of the population. It also causes both sides to consistently misconstrue what their political opponents actually believe. One area of rank and inexcusable blindness on the right is their belief that their political opponents are ideological socialists. This is flagrantly untrue. The left in America doesn't give a shit about economics. I deal on a daily basis with Marxists who have no idea what relations of production or historical materialism even are, but can explain academic intersectional feminism perfectly. Only since Trump's win has talk of economic inequality on the left been heard, and this from voices like myself that tend to get dismissed by the mainstream identity politics leftists as brocialists or class reductionists. Conversely, the left in America is convinced that the right is a racist monolith. Again, conversely, with the exception of the small and fractured alt-right, the American right cares a lot less about race and gender than the left thinks they do. The US right is mainly about lowering taxes. Period. The end. Guns and global power projection come in as distant second and third. So right and left alike are basically talking over one another, largely in their own respective echo chambers and projecting their own fears onto one another. It's a frosty day in hell, quite frankly, when one decides to attack the other for what it truly is, and not what they themselves are afraid of. The US left is obsessed with fighting the KKK. The US right is obsessed with fighting the Soviets, neither of which are an accurate assumption about their respective opponents. The upshot of all of this is that both factions are marked by self-absorption and withdrawal from engagement with the American people. This has made both sides politically weak. The numerous structural factors outlined above has resulted in right and left becoming ideologically rigid, and this, I think, has caused frustration among an electorate that feels alienated from the political process and has given rise to alternative politics in the last few years. The alt-right, with its emphasis on cultural and ethnic nationalism, and the alt-left, with its emphasis on economic inequality, are reflecting issues that resonate with large blocks of the electorate, but are completely off the radars of their respective establishment political leadership. The regrettable fact is that the kinds of political conversations my family and I used to have, generally reasonable and respectful despite the growing pile of empty beer cans and bourbon bottles that would accumulate over the course of an evening, prior to my father's untimely passing due to a heart attack, are becoming rarer. Today, social justice warrior friends of mine on Facebook bragged, yes, bragged, about severing ties with friends and even family who supported Trump in the last election, and this from people who aren't even Americans. Given how polarizing a figure Trump is and how mired in controversies, baseless or otherwise, both Trump and Clinton were, this is only going to get worse in the coming years. This has been Agent Connie. Over and out.